Could you briefly outline the thesis of Crisis in Leviathan and help us understand the events of the last 11 years in light of the history that you lay out here?
The topic of Crisis in Leviathan is the growth of government in the United States from the late 19th century to the late 20th century. That growth has many causes, and I start off the book by making clear that I'm not offering a new favorite cause explanation for that complex development. It can be related and traced back to a great many changes in the nature of social and economic change during that period, and changes in ideology and political changes of various sorts and so forth. But my own development of that theme in that book focused on the fact that the growth of government over that century was not slow and steady. It was instead episodically interrupted by big lurches in the size, scope, and power of the government. And at the time I began my work on the book in the late 1970s, most of the economists who were working were basically ignoring that profile. They were attempting to explain the long-term growth of government without worrying about the exact path it followed in the course of its growth. It seemed to me, after some years of reading and studying and teaching economic history in connection with this experience, that ignoring the profile of the way government had grown was missing a great deal of an understanding about why it had grown. And it seemed to me increasingly, as I continued my research, that these episodes of abrupt growth, which were all focused on national emergencies such as the World Wars and the Great Depression, those three more than any others, those episodes didn't behave the way many people at the time thought they ought to behave, or how historians later imagined they had behaved. That is to say, very often when the government expanded its power in one of these emergencies, there was a kind of promise, sometimes explicit, that the government would exercise extraordinary powers in order to deal with the crisis at hand, but that once the crisis had passed, once it had been dealt with adequately, then the government would relinquish those powers and revert to something like the status quo ante bellum. That, however, had never happened, and it led me to formulate a new version of an old idea, which I called the Ratchet Phenomenon, or the Ratchet Effect, which is the idea that in the national emergencies, the government would grow abruptly in size, scope, and power. After the emergency had clearly passed, it would indeed relinquish some of the new powers, but not all. Never would it relinquish all. And so instead of growing along a steady upward tilting path like that for various reasons, it would grow along a smooth path, abruptly increase, partially retrench, and then resume growth along a higher trajectory. So that each one of these crisis periods, in effect, shifted the size, scope, and power of government to a higher level and created a higher baseline from which it would grow abruptly on the occasion of the next crisis. So as I attempted to sort of research the facts of history and find out how they related to this pattern, I became more and more convinced that there was a logic behind the ratchet effect, and that it involved not simply the kinds of changes that other economists had identified, such as fiscal changes in, say, government spending or tax revenues or borrowing, which all increase abruptly during these national emergencies, but perhaps more important, involved changes in institutions which were enduring. Government would create new bureaus. It would pass new laws. It would change the conditions that allowed it to exercise coercion over the society. And then it would retain some of those powers after the crisis had passed. And another dimension of the crisis was that in the course of passing through these episodes, people's thinking would be changed. People have a habit of getting used to things that they must endure for some time, particularly for years on end. And having got used to them, even if they objected to these conditions before, they may therefore accept them more readily henceforth. Each crisis softens them up, as it were, to tolerate a larger government, a more powerful government, a government with wider reach. And that was the logic I found borne out. And when the attacks of 9/11 happened, and I began to receive calls from reporters who had some familiarity with that historical work, asking me what I thought the effect of 9/11 would be, I said that it would probably be the same as it had been before, that in the wake of these attacks, people being more fearful, people being uncertain about what was going on or how they should deal with it, would turn to the state. The state would take advantage of this concession, as it were, in the citizens' normal resistance to the growth of government, and the upshot would be another upward ratchet in the size, scope, and power of government. And I'm absolutely convinced that that is exactly what has happened during the 12 years since 9/11 attacks. And so I believe current history, recent history, fits the pattern of the preceding century very well in terms of its logic. Each such episode has unique specifics, of course, unique personalities and many differences, but the inner logic, what is driving this growth in episodic manner through a ratchet process, remains the same.
Well, we've certainly observed it on steroids, as you cited. Anthony,
Yes?
your hot off the press new book from Cambridge University Press, The Power of Habeas Corpus in America, From the King's Prerogative to the War on Terror. You've spent the past several years becoming expert in habeas corpus, and your book reflects that. It's been endorsed by scholars and civil liberties leaders across the board and is earning very, very high praise, and rightfully so. But what about habeas corpus made you think that it was an important thing for you to spend the last few years of your life on? And what about it can help us in our fight for our liberties in the midst of war on terror?
Well, during the Bush years, the first years of the war on terror, I was, like many other Americans, horrified by a number of practices that the administration dealt in Guantanamo and otherwise with detention policy. And I had long taken the traditional civil libertarian view that the most fundamental of our liberties in the Anglo-American tradition is the right of habeas corpus. Because if the government can jail somebody without even saying why, then all of these other freedoms seem moot. Like many other civil libertarians, I believed that the legal history of habeas corpus was very simply on our side, that what the Bush administration was doing was clearly outside the bounds of the tradition, and that if I just looked into it a bit, I could come up with that airtight silver bullet argument for what they were doing and why it was so wrong. As I researched more and the paper became a book, I discovered that the history of habeas corpus is unfortunately a lot rockier and less clear-cut than that. Starting in England, which is actually more important than it might seem to a lot of people in the United States, because even these Supreme Court decisions often discuss English